So I'm the Chief Technology Officer at the Auction Collective and have spent years in leadership roles here in the Silicon Valley, crafting AI as well as software solutions. And I've also been privileged to have been on the technology advisory board for a number of leading startups as well as enterprises here in the Silicon Valley. At the Auction Collective, we are pioneering and we are creating a radically new technology platform that's being used by a range of different companies, a number of them over here that I've listed out, for creating their own auctions. So think of us as a Shopify for auctions, right? So we are serving roughly about $850 billion marketplace worldwide. We are fully self-serve, and please, after this, do check us out at indie.auction or theauctioncollective.com. All right, so these are all patterns that we find in nature. Today, however, we are going to be talking about how some leading generative AI companies are leveraging these patterns for delivering on solutions, right? So we're going to be talking about some real-world examples of a strategic framework that's being used by companies to deliver on generative AI solutions as well as part of their organizations. So let's first look at a comprehensive framework for implementing these solutions. You'll typically be starting with setting up the foundation for your infrastructure. And a big part of that is creation of some of the core technical capabilities that you need as part of your infrastructure. You want to start with single domain proof of concepts, which are typically pilots, get the buy-in from your customer base, align that with the key KPIs that you want to target, which can often be return on investment. We are seeing a lot of that emerge, employee productivity. It could be new revenue streams that your company is looking to generate as well. At this stage, this is the stage from a technical standpoint and an infrastructure standpoint. I'm seeing companies then start to look at laying the foundation for a model abstraction layer, correct? There's a constant stream of new models being launched with a very high number of parameters, billions of parameters. And so you want to have that flexibility and adaptability built into your infrastructure at the very beginning to be able to adapt and flex based on that. A good time for you at the foundational layer is also identifying the key team members that are going to be part of your development process. So that includes machine learning, it includes data science, includes ML operations, LLM operations, product, business, and so on. Moving forward, so once you've had a number of quick wins at the first stage, you then want to move forward into what's referred to as the orchestration stage, right? Which is the time when you want to start looking at what are some of the key cross-domain projects that you'd like to focus on, right? So it could be at the very first stage, you've set up a pilot that's for, let's say, your human resources department or customer experience. This is the stage where you want to start looking at what are some of the key cross-domain programs that you can start initiating as part of your pipeline. Yeah, so it could be human resources with legal combined with product. Now, at this stage, from a technology infrastructure standpoint, then you also are looking at certain additional capabilities. So it's no longer just a frontier model that you're leveraging, but you're starting to then enhance customer experiences using retrieval augmented generation, for example, correct? So leveraging tool use. You want to, at some point, also maybe start combining this with fine-tuning, which is, of course, an overhead. However, you can definitely define some very specific, domain-specific use cases for fine-tuning models as well. Moving on to the next stage is when you're now starting to expand into partner ecosystems. Yeah. At the early stages, you do not, what I've seen a number of companies make the mistake is starting to expose mission critical customer data as part of their implementations. You absolutely do not want to do that at the early stages. It's when you reach the later stages and a certain level of maturity is when you want to start looking at expanding into a partner ecosystem. It could be like MCP, right, which is becoming very prominent now. It could be either you're setting up like your own MCP servers, like HubSpot, Salesforce, a number of other companies, or you could be looking at just setting up your client infrastructure as well. The next stage is when is exciting because at this stage you've reached a certain point of maturity and you're starting to look at what does it mean for us to start creating AI native business models. I was just talking to a company the other day where they're building like an agentic framework, and they're already starting to pivot in terms of how do they enhance that experience, primarily from a chargeback standpoint with the blockchain, right? So there's a lot of innovation that's taking place in the industry right now. Reality check, however, is, and this is coming from industry surveys, is about 48% of pilots end up failing. Yeah, so high failure rate, but there's going to be a lot of experimentation involved in this journey. So just unpacking that into a tiered framework that can be leveraged. You want to, as you're unpacking the previous pipeline of initiatives and projects, you want to start establishing a core set of AI services, right? So that can, of course, include things like you've got your model abstraction layers, you're starting to do your prompt engineering best practices as well, embeddings, deciding, making some technical choices as it relates to your vector databases. Are you going to be using Pinecone, BV8, and so on? And then, of course, there are going to be some key decisions that you're making as well as you're building out your infrastructure, which is it going to be a build versus a buy? Other areas that you want to then start looking at is, of course, a lot of companies are focused on how do we integrate with our existing platforms and systems. And as we progress through this, I'm going to unpack and we're going to look at some best practices and patterns in order to integrate with your existing platforms as well. So building observability, now this is key, right? So 30% of the effort that companies are putting in for enhancing and enabling their businesses with generative AI is just during the build phase. The remainder of that effort all goes into the deployment processes, the maintenance, business as usual, and keeping the lights on. So LLM operations definitely very key, even for areas such as like safety and security and for establishing guardrails. All right, so some of the common problems when you're first getting started, and a lot of companies I've been seeing making this initial mistake, which is you've got different departments, you've got different groups, different lines of businesses, regions, and each of them, they're going out and creating their own accounts, whether it's with OpenAI, Mistral, or Anthropic, and there's just a proliferation of all these different LLMs out there. Leads to a number of problems, as you can imagine, right? So you're going to have inconsistent customer experiences across different regions, different customer touch points. So for example, if you're in healthcare, right, just imagine you've got a customer-facing application, customers coming in, and you don't have any consistency with your HIPAA regulations, right, that apply to those customers. So it's going to be creating a lot of problems. The way to address this, you want to be able to start with a centralized frontier model or a centralized LLM service that is just then going to serve with, and this is the place where you want to start establishing your guardrails. You want to create your evaluation framework so that it's going to be very consistent across all the different deployments that you have going forward. A number of, by the way, financial services companies, I think Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, they're actually using this pattern very successfully by establishing things like a unified or an enterprise LLM gateway to start with. Okay. So this one's close to us because, one of the business use cases that we're trying to solve for at the Auction Collective, for example, we serve very high transaction volumes as it relates to low latency bidding infrastructure. And so if you're in a financial services company or you're building a fintech product, you're going to understand the challenges that exist with generative AI as it pertains very specifically to high concurrency systems, right? Hyperscale performance. A number of companies, what they're doing is creating, and for each individual session context or a transaction context, they're creating and loading a memory model in place. That is going to increase significantly the memory consumption, the memory footprint, as well as the compute that is required. The best practice here is what's often referred to as a flyweight strategy. Yeah. NASDAQ, they have a market surveillance AI, which is phenomenal. You should go check it out. They actually use a flyweight strategy, which is it's a combination where you have all the immutable components. So for example, your model weights, your embeddings is shared infrastructure. And you then create session-specific context that is model instances that are very specific to the individual user sessions that you're trying to solve for. So they're using this primarily to detect, for example, insider trading across across the industry as well. Very effective pattern. All right, so we're going to talk about observability next. So in the first pattern, and as part of the first phase, we kind of touched upon this concept of creating a centralized and starting off with a centralized LLM infrastructure at first. That, however, can lead to certain problems as well, which is creating a centralized infrastructure that does not have any visibility into the behavior within the model, right? So you've often seen places where toxicity can creep in. There can be, factual correctness that is lacking, or there's hallucinations. And this is, of course, a problem that leads to later on challenges in terms of troubleshooting production issues as well. I love this pattern, by the way. So this one is really about creating observers, right? So creating observers where you have a base model that also registers as what's referred to as a notifier. And so each of these observers is basically observing certain behaviors within your platform, correct? So as an example, you could have you'll have an input observer that looks at all the inputs that are coming in. So it'll look at the user context, it'll look at the user intent. You've got a metrics observer that is really tracking for token usage, if people are still using that for billing purposes. And so on. So if you're in a highly regulated industry and you have the need for, as an example, right, Palantir, they use this very effectively. They use it because they have these systems that are interfacing with government, with the government APIs, and so they absolutely need all these watch and balances across setting up the flags and the alerts for any threat actors, as well as monitoring on the basis of these observers as well. So great design pattern to use. All right, adapters. So point to point, this is a stage where there's a number of companies, as there's disparate implementations that are being created across departments, across regions, you'll see this start to emerge, right? Which is a web of complexity with a lot of connections going across your existing systems with generative AI implementations as well. Create an abstraction layer, correct? On the left-hand side, you can see what's referred to as the enterprise adapters, which will then let you create a separation of your data formats that you get from your legacy and your existing systems, right? Salesforce Einstein GPT, they use this pattern very effectively. So they've been using this, wherein they have a separation. We're using your enterprise adapters, and then on the right-hand side, you've got the model adapters. So it gives you the benefit of two things. One is you can flex and adapt. You can integrate with your existing platforms, while also giving you the ability to be able to adapt different models as they're evolving. So a lot of benefits as it relates to future-proofing your infrastructure as well. All right, my favorite cup of coffee with whipped cream, right? I'm just a simple guy. So number of companies, again, common mistake, raw LLM, you're getting unfiltered responses, there's no guardrails, and so oftentimes in scenarios such as this too, if there is content that is changing in the enterprise, there's no way for you to track, how that change in content is reflecting on the end outputs. Number of teams that I've seen, they're also starting to embed guardrails right into their prompt engine, into their prompts itself. That's a really bad practice, right? Because it does not let you evolve your platform for the future. The way to address this is a decorator approach, which is each layer and each component continues to enhance the experience that you're looking for based on the output that's being generated. So for example, right, you've got a customer request that's come in. You first want to enhance it with for some fact-checking purposes, right? So you want to do that with some additional business rules that are going to use to vet and validate the output that's being generated. Pass it along to, let's say, you want to further localize the output that's being generated as well. So you can definitely apply, formatting rules as well as you progress through each layer that's enhanced further. And Anthropic's, the constitutional AI framework actually uses this particular strategy very effectively. All right, the Clone Wars, right? Everybody's watched The Matrix and Star Wars. Cloning. So cloning is a great strategy for faster time to market. Yeah, you do not have to rebuild, you do not have to reinvent the wheel each time around. And a number of companies are doing exactly that, which is you start with the frontier model, you start creating your clones, and it's going to take a lot of resources in terms of training resources for your model as well. Instead, the approach to take here is, and Google does this with their base T5 model as well, where they're able to create different market-specific AI models based on the frontier model, correct? Which is creating a layer that has that you apply your fine-tuning with, right? And definitely you don't have to fine-tune all the billions of parameters out there. You want to be able to identify, use very parameter-efficient fine-tuning techniques such as LoRa that's out there to fine-tune and create smaller models. And then for each of these, have this model adaptation layer that's created in order to enhance the experience for each individual domain-specific model that's being created from that. So this one's close to us. This was a watch that we had actually auctioned. It's a one-of-a-kind watch. But what I really want you to focus on here is the complexity in terms of the chains, the gear system that's typical to a well-designed watch, right? And that's a good lead-in into the next approach that I'm going to talk about, which is how do you chain different areas of responsibility in order to further enhance your platform. An example here is you starting with a user request and first and foremost enhancing that output with RAG as an example, right? So you do a vector database lookup. Let's just say that you do not get the kind of response that you were expecting with that first lookup. You then move along with your React agent that then does some additional tool chaining in order to refine and enhance that output as well. If that still does not work and it does not pass through your, let's say, your guardrails or the type of response that you were expect, Maybe there's some level of a model drift that you're experiencing as well that's being flagged. You then want to pass it along to a human in the loop for further expert guidance as well. So air traffic control, very complex. Again, this is a pattern that's very effective if you're starting to create complexity with point-to-point. So somewhat similar to the one that we talked about previously as well, right? And again, these are patterns and best practices that you want to pick and choose. You want to select. There's always going to be a hybrid approach of which pattern works for a specific stage of your full generative AI lifecycle that we touched upon. Over here, you're creating a mediator, which is on the left-hand side, as it's illustrated, you've got all your rack components. On the right-hand side, you've got all your agent components. If you're starting to go down that path, you're using your protocols, whether it's MCP, whether it's A2A for agent-to-agent communication, so forth. But you want to be able to mediate all and channel all these interactions through that central mediator. Yeah. So a couple of key takeaways for us. Contrary to popular belief, as part of your phase one that we first talked about, circling back to that, you do not want to always start with customer-facing applications, correct? You do not want to expose your customer-sensitive data if things are not working. You want to be able to, and I'm seeing a lot of companies derive ROI benefit when they first start with operationalizing their back-end first, with back-end operations, right? So it could be like, for example, your supply chain management or your inventory management system. Bring in human in the loop, right? It's not just all about automation. A lot of value in doing that as well, at least at this stage of generative AI. Use a patterns-oriented constellation approach, right? Super mobile apps definitely work. Super generative AI apps do not at least so far. So use a constellation-based approach, which is identify the key KPIs you're trying to solve for, the domains, have a multi-agentic approach in order to help address complex business process workflows in the organization. Right? And yeah, I encourage all of you to go and industrialize this, right? Patterns-oriented AI is well accepted. I'll quote Anthropic, where they talked about generative AI applications, keep them simple and use composable patterns. So, can we declare one best pattern? Not really. This is kind of a salad bar thing. You've got to pick and choose and select what works best for your specific use cases. So let me give you a few things in closing. This is the one you want to scan. Once again, check us out at indie.auction or the auctioncollective.com. And I'll be hanging around if you like to network or if you have questions. But have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and thank you for all being here.